Welcome to the first ever AI conference hosted by the ACC National Capital Region chapter. First, we'd like to thank you for your flexibility today. Our first program scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning needed to be postponed due to a last-minute emergency. We do intend to reschedule the program, and please be on the lookout for a message from the chapter regarding exactly when that will occur. Now, today's event is hosted by the chapter's Technology and Intellectual Property Committee, Ethics and Compliance Committee, and Employment and Labor Committee. We'd like to also thank the law firms Polzanelli, Davis Wright Tremaine, Williams and Connolly, and Haynes Boone for sponsoring this event. My name is Steve Tibbetts, and along with my Tech and IP Committee colleague and President-elect Angie Stinson and Ethics and Compliance Committee Co-Chair Karina Vollmer, we wish you a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and we are excited to continue our AI-oriented programming. Angie?
Thanks, Steve. And welcome to everybody who's joining today. As the topic of AI has dominated the news and affected every corner of business and government, the chapter has seen an unprecedented interest in AI programming from our membership. As members, we're all wrestling not only with the regulatory, ethical, and technical compliance challenges AI poses, but also with the question of how to put AI to use most effectively in supporting our day-to-day work. As you can see from the agenda, the modified agenda, today's slate of programming focuses on public security, internal security and compliance, intellectual property issues, and technology transactions. We expect to walk away today with valuable insights from our slate of wonderful panelists that we can use in our individual law departments. Thank you all for joining us for this conference. And I'll turn the virtual mic back to Steve.
Now, we don't foresee any slowdown in AI developments or interest in them, and we're planning future programs accordingly, including our annual Privacy and Technology Conference, which will be held in person at Westwood Country Club on October 21, 2026. So that's a little ways out, but circle that day on your calendars now. Please save that date for one of the chapter's biggest CLE events of the year.
Good afternoon, everyone. ACC National Capital Region and our sponsor, Davis Wright Tremaine, are pleased to present this webcast program, Who's Really Logging In? Detection, Prevention, and Employer Response Strategies to Remote Workforce Fraud. My name is Hannah Brescian. I'm VP, Deputy General Counsel, Labor and Employment at CACI International, and Chair of the Employment and Labor Committee. I, along with Anya Stinson, Associate General Counsel at the National Student Clearinghouse and member of the Tech and IP Committee, will serve as the chapter's host for today's seminar. Please note that today's program is being recorded. All participants should have received a copy of today's slides in the reminder email. If you did not receive the email, please check your spam junk folder. We will also place a copy of the slides in the chat box where you can download the slides directly. If you still need a copy, please feel free to email Janine Wen. If you've dialed into today's program by telephone, please note that you will not receive CLE credit. To comply with the VA MCLE rules, you will need to be logged in with your name and company. If you have any trouble with sound, please feel free to turn on the captions for running transcript. Look to the tool to select captions at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation will last approximately 60 minutes. You can queue up a question for us at any time during today's presentation by using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The panel will address your questions as time permits. However, to ensure that we have sufficient time for the CLE content, we may need to hold questions. All remarks made today by our panelists are their own opinions and don't constitute legal advice or necessarily reflect the viewpoints of their company or firm or of the ACC National Capital Region. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's presentation. Michael Borgia is a partner at Davis Wright Tremaine, specializing in cybersecurity, data privacy, and internal investigations. He provides strategic counsel on navigating the legal and technical landscapes of data breaches and employee-related fraud to help companies secure their digital environments. Jeremy Melkison is partner at Davis Wright Tremaine, where he leads the DC office's labor and employment team. Jeremy draws from his prior in-house experience in DC to give practical guidance to public companies, privately held corporations, nonprofits, and trade associations in managing the entire workforce life cycle, from recruitment to separation to enforcement of post-employment obligations and beyond. Julie Breyer is corporate counsel at Dodge and Cox, where she advises on employment, litigation, and commercial contracts, and the AI and technology governance. Her practice includes navigating the evolving challenges of remote workforce management, including partnering with leadership to develop contingent staffing agreements and internal controls that address cybersecurity risks and workforce fraud. Grace Fu is the Chief Legal and Administrative Officer at Nanit, overseeing legal, compliance, and human resources functions. She brings significant experience in managing the operational requirements of remote workforces, with a focus on implementing effective onboarding and identifying verification processes to mitigate organizational risk. Noah Rubin is the Senior Director of Complex Digital Events and Expert Services at Kroll, where he leads the investigation of sophisticated digital fraud and cyber threats. He leverages extensive experience in digital forensics and investigative analytics to help corporations detect and remediate illicit activities within their remote workforce. With that, let's begin today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's great to be with you all today. We have a fantastic panel with deep expertise across multiple different disciplines: employment, privacy, general counsel, and digital forensics. So let's get started. The way that companies hire has changed dramatically. Many organizations now recruit, interview, onboard, and manage employees entirely remotely, never once meeting them face to face. And that convenience comes with a hidden vulnerability that we're just now reading about in the news and experiencing in our practices. How do you really know who's on the other side of the screen? Fraudulent remote workers, including foreign state actors, are exploiting exactly that blind spot. Using AI-generated resumes, deep fake videos, voice cloning, they're passing interviews, clearing background checks, and gaining access to your sensitive systems without ever being who they claim they say they are. Catching and responding to this threat isn't a job for just one person. It takes legal, it takes HR, it takes IT, it takes business leadership working together, sharing and coordinating, and building controls that no single function can manage alone. In the next hour, we're going to walk through how these attacks work, what warning signs to look for, how to investigate when something goes wrong, and the legal and regulatory consequences that companies face. We'll also tackle a related issue, which is employees using AI to quietly hold 2 or 3 jobs at once. So before we get started, I just want to introduce the topic with a short video that lays out the groundwork and brings this threat to life. So let's take a look at that video now. Mike, I think you need to unmute the sound.
Mike, try going off mute yourself.
Watch closely this video interview between a hiring manager at Vidoc. Watch closely this video interview between a hiring manager at Vidoc Security Lab and a job candidate.
Can you take your hand and put it like in front of your face to like cover it partially? No, it's not a joke because I can see that you're using some kind of software.
The applicant was hiding his true identity by using a deepfake AI filter.
Something was really off. I wanted to have a proof that he was a real person or not. And the first thing that came to my mind was, let's put your hand in front of your face, because I knew AI tools that change your face, like Snapchat filters, they won't work when you partially occlude the face. I asked him to do it, and he knew that the filter would break, and he didn't do it. At this point, I was like 100% sure that he was trying to trick me. Okay, thank you.
Deepfake scams have already cost companies millions of dollars worldwide, and the threat is is only growing. AI-generated fraud, including tactics like deepfakes, could cost the U.S. financial sector up to $40 billion by 2027, up from $12.3 billion in 2023. Fraudulent job seekers can originate from anywhere. Fake candidates linked to North Korea have drawn significant headlines in recent months. In May 2024, the Justice Department alleged that more than 300 U.S. companies had unknowingly hired imposters with ties to North Korea for remote IT roles, sending at least $6.8 million in earnings to the North Korean regime.
So when we hire fake candidates which are from sanctioned nation, it becomes a national security concern, because once these individuals are in an organization, they're taking that salary and funding activities back in those nations. And those activities can be illicit as well. So inadvertently, we are funding illicit activities in sanctioned nations. The second issue is that when they poison the algorithms, when there is an adversarial AI attack within the organization by this fake employee, our algorithms create outputs which are not intended to, and that can be malicious output. They can be racial, they can be segregating and causing a societal divide in our countries, etc. So without realizing, we are becoming a problem for social disruption, which is also a national security concern.
Watch clip.
Okay. Great. Well, yeah, it's a very disturbing and interesting video, and it highlights a lot of aspects of this problem. Remote worker fraud, as you see reflected in the video, is really at an inflection point. And there's a few reasons why. This has been going on. This is not a new problem. That's been going on for a number of years at a pretty good scale. But we're at an inflection point for a few reasons. One is remote work is now the norm, right? During COVID, after COVID, the number of people working remotely, part-time, full-time, has increased dramatically. You see here on the slide, for example, about 53% of remote capable workers split time between home and office. 25% of paid work days in the US are now done from home. It's up from 5% pre-pandemic. AI is a huge part in two ways. First of all, social engineering powered by AI. We just saw that in the video. Deepfake videos, voice cloning, things that just a few years ago we really wouldn't have thought practical, that you could have someone else's face on a video and have it be really convincing, or fake someone else's voice. These things are all making, as well as AI-driven fraudulent communications and emails and things, helping non-native speakers write like a native speaker. These are enabling a sophistication in the fraud that wasn't possible even maybe just a year ago or longer than that. Other uses of AI, like agentic AI, it's helping the attackers, certainly, helping them automate things if they get a job as a coder, helping them write code more quickly, right? Doing things that allow them to pose as an employee more effectively for a longer period of time. This also makes detection harder. Even as recently as last year, we were telling people, look out for signs of automation, AI usage, things like that. Well, now companies are encouraging their employees to use that. So where AI is being adopted across the enterprise, an attacker using AI is less likely to be detected. And finally, the standard detection methods are being outpaced, right? Asking someone to join a video call used to be very, very effective. Let me see your face so I know that you're really who you say you are. Well, now that can be faked. As we've seen, North Korean hackers have been doing that with a high degree of effectiveness. Okay. Anyone can be a target, and this is really, really important to emphasize. So if you're sitting here thinking, I'm not a government contractor, I don't have a ton of, I don't have state secrets, I don't have deeply sensitive data, I don't think North Korean hackers or others would be that interested in me. That is naive. Anyone with remote workers is a target. Anyone who will pay money to a remote worker is a target. As the video highlighted, one of the main things that attackers are trying to do here, especially in North Korea, is to earn money, earn a paycheck, and use it to fund illicit activities back in the country. So again, if you are willing to pay out a paycheck, then you are a potential target here, because they can use the money from that to fund what they're looking for. There are many motivations. right? And that could be, again, the core is earning a paycheck, but it could also be stealing source code and IP, staging other cyber attacks, things like that. Smaller and mid-sized companies absolutely have been targeted left and right. This is a problem for companies of all sizes. Very interesting angle to this. There is sometimes a US-based quote unquote facilitator. We'll talk about a case, US versus Chapman, really interesting case, where people in the United States are working with North Koreans to, or others, to set up like a laptop farm. They'll have the laptop in their house or a series of laptops in their house. The foreign actors will connect into that, and then the laptop, the company's laptop they issued the remote worker will be sitting somewhere in the U.S. Maintained by this facilitator who's helping helping the foreign actors. Again, remote technical uh, roles are a target for a number of reasons. They tend to be more remote, but also because they're skills that line up with the type of skills that these North Korean and other hackers have.
So we thought it would be helpful as part of this discussion today, not to just sort of give you a set of red flags and things to watch for, but rather to explore it through the concept of a fictional company called Omicron. And this fictional company is going to be at our headquarters today to understand how this comes up through the entire life cycle of the worker, including both the uh, what happens when you're hiring them, all the way through what happens when you find out that maybe you have a problem that has slipped through the gates. So just to set the stage, Omicron is a mid-sized SaaS provider headquartered in a college town. It's about to go to launch for direct-to-consumer product next year, requiring a substantial expansion of both software development and cloud infrastructure. Localized talent in that college town is tough to find, and they also don't necessarily need local workers. They can get remote workforce perhaps cheaper. And so they hire several software developers as full-time employees, and they also engage a staffing agency to bring on some contingent workers through the cloud network for the cloud network. And they're going to work remotely, both in the US and abroad, India and the Philippines. So all the candidates, including both the employees and the independent contractors, are passing multiple rounds of remote interviews, and they all demonstrate strong technical knowledge through live questionnaires. I'm sorry, can you mute your sound? I'm so sorry. There's a there's an individual whose sound is interfering. There we go. Great. Unbeknownst to Omicron, one of the contingent workers is actually a malicious North Korean operative. So I'm going to turn it over now to our panelists and try to talk a little bit about what else Omicron could have done. And so we can go on the next slide. I'd like to hear from Julia first to understand what additional layers maybe should we expect a reasonable employer to add today on the hiring front to keep this problem from having gotten past the initial controls.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone for being here. First, let me just say these views are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of Dodge and Cox. But with that in mind, what could Omicron do? So I think if they were engaging those remote workers through a third-party staffing agency, right, specifically to the contingent workers, there are a number of things that they should keep in mind at the front end. So looking at their staffing agency contracts and their statements of work, they should disclose specifically where work is being performed and by whom. So at least you have some sense of what's going on. They should think about requiring subcontractor flow down obligations so that the direct agency that you're in contract with has affirmatively represented that their subcontractors will also comply with the same safeguards. Of course, that doesn't prevent the problem, but at least you have some recourse and it puts teeth on your staffing agency's obligations. Also, prohibiting subcontracting without prior written approval. The further you get from the company, the Omicron to staffing agency relationship, the less oversight you have. So you may want to limit that subcontracting capability, or at least have some visibility into when it's happening and with whom, so that you're getting certificates of insurance from those subcontractors, and you have more oversight into how they're hiring and engaging their workers. You should think about, or Omicron should think about, whether they are engaging those contingent workers through an employment model or an independent contractor model. If you're talking about workers who are being hired in the US, that employment model has some baked in benefits, right? They're going to go through a standard employee onboarding process that requires identity verification through a Form I-9. The background check process is probably more protective here. And of course, all of the standard things that you would want to think about in a contract with a vendor, staffing agency or otherwise. What are your indemnification protections? What audit rights do you have? If you think something smells a little bad, can you peek under the hood of that staffing agency's hiring records? And importantly, make sure that all of those contracts for Omicron's contingent workers have the ability to have the company remove a contingent worker from access at the click of a button, so that there's no contractual provision preventing your IT team from cutting off that person's access immediately if something comes up.
Well, that sounds all fine and good, and that might help us with the staffing agency. But is there anything, turn this over to Grace, is there anything from like an interview or HR perspective from the company, from Omicron's perspective, that they could have done better before they let this North Korean contingent worker on board at the company?
Sure. So Julia talked about this a little bit, but relying on background checks, making sure that the company that you use for background checks is actually doing a deep dive into verification of that person's background, all of their contact information, and making sure that all of that checks out before you actually onboard the candidate. Also in this day and age, people have social media accounts. Make sure that that's included as part of the scope of the review, and make sure to be aware of any flags, right? If you see someone's account is very thin or recently created, that might be a flag, right? That might be an account that was created just for the purposes of this job application. So something to think about. The co-founder in the video did something really interesting. He asked the candidate to put his hand in front of his face. So there are some, strategies you can employ in the interview process as well. If there is a suspicion that this candidate might not be a real candidate as presented. You may ask pointed questions that relate to their background, right? You can ask about local landmarks, time zone specific events, any regional context. You might, if they're talking about prior work, you might ask for a live screen share of past work product. The caveat here is I would say that the co-founder in that video seemed to be pretty tech and AI savvy. Not everybody is. So I would not kind of employ these on a sort of global basis, but in cases where, you really feel like they could be helpful and that the right person is employing these strategies.
That's really,
yeah.
Oh, that's really, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
Go
Grace.
ahead, Jeremy.
So I mean, I get all that, and that all makes sense from the company's perspective, but sometimes these processes are set up such that you almost have AI talking to AI.
Yeah.
That you have your own systems are automated in such a way that you wouldn't be able to necessarily catch these things. I want to turn this over to Noah, who's our computer forensics expert on this. Give us a little bit sort of an education here from that side of the house, understanding that our audience here is not primarily driven by or is not primarily IT personnel, but just to give us some from red flags or things that you might consider doing from the IT perspective that you should at least be considering if you're if you're starting at square one here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's worthwhile, clarifying that the advice that Grace is giving and also that I'm going to expound on is not necessarily just for IT folks. There's sort of varying levels of technical sophistication that you can apply to this. Grace is talking about, for example, having someone wave their hand in front of their face, like we saw in the video. That is surprisingly effective. There are also software companies that are entirely built around verification of legitimate identities during, for example, video interviews, right? And there's a term that folks use around this called liveness checks, and they use various signals, the technical sophistication with which they try and identify AI during a video interview. That's their problem. But as a user of that software, right, it's good to know you can employ these things during the interview without being technical, and it will give you another signal to try and determine without having that awkward, please put your hand in front of your face thing, or as an additional check to say, is this person legitimate or not? And I wouldn't say that's necessarily dispositive to say, okay, well, if the software says that they're bad, then they're definitely bad. But that's a signal for further investigation. And if you get that sort of initial signal, even if you just get that weird feeling, like the example I like to give is when you get into a Lyft, right? I hope that, or an Uber, maybe most people use Uber. I'm a Lyft guy. And you get into the car and you compare someone's photo against the person you see in the car. If it doesn't pass a smell test, get out of the car. That's my personal policy. Like I had one the other day where it was his dad purportedly and not him, right? That doesn't work for me. And so if you have that initial signal, then that's a trigger for further investigation, right? And you can look at things like AI generated image detection tools, right? So if someone has a resume, but they also have a GitHub and a LinkedIn, looking at the freshness of a profile, like Grace was saying, how new is this, is one signal. But also you can just, for example, pop the image into Google reverse image search. Have they used this somewhere else? That can be surprisingly effective at times. AI generated image detection tools. There are a number of things that you can use once you have that initial signal of this might be a bad actor.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw one more out there and then pass over to Mike. But one of the things that most people do not do with respect to new hires, even remote hires, is to check their educational history. You may be relying on a staffing company to do some initial checks on screens or some kind of app to do those screens. I think that the takeaway for me is that in most instances, the person who is a fraudulent worker is not going to be able to make up their educational history in such a way that it won't be subject to check. Now, they may be able to bypass that by having a fake identity, and that identity happens to be somebody who has the degree. But my counseling for most employers on this is to have steps in place to, for particularly remote workers that you never meet in person, is to make sure that you've checked their educational history. It's low tech, and it probably has a large return on your investment of time. So, Mike, any other thoughts about this?
Just to add to, I think, keep in mind employee privacy laws, and I include, state privacy laws. Most don't apply to employees, but CCPA in California does, for example. Biometrics laws like BIPA in Illinois, that does apply, right? Depending on what you're collecting and what you're using it for. So think about that. Think about what permissions you need, things like that. There is also important to keep in mind FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? If you're using tools that are going out collecting, I mean, obviously the background check, yes, for sure. But if you're also using tools and thinking about how do we tell if this is a real person? Can we verify them? It's a great idea. But keep in mind that there may be some things you need to do about getting permission or providing notifications, things like that. So, and it's easy to forget that because although this feels very novel, there are some not very novel laws in some ways, like old FCRA, that will still apply and can be quite complicated.
Yeah, those are good points.
I had one other thing quickly I just wanted to cover. Sorry, we can move to the next one, which is, Microsoft and some other security companies have reported that these actors are scraping employment pages, right? This is a fairly widely reported tactic at this point, but sort of as a baseline, if I were the bad actor, right? I would need to know what roles are open to me, sort of fit my requirements, my specifications, like Mike talked about, more technical style roles. For certain systems where you actually have access to the traffic coming to, for example, your Workday hiring system, you can actually compare where the traffic is coming from with sort of known bad IP blocks and other sort of technical indicators like you're talking about. This is more of a IT security question than a legal question, but you can sort of get ahead of the threat. You see that you are being targeted, your specific roles at your company are being targeted.
All right, so let's return to our story, talk about some early warning signs that emerged for Omicron. So several weeks of work were our remote workers. Two different teams, note concerns about one of the contingent cloud network administrators. An engineering lead raises really sort of wellness concerns to HR and mentions that this worker is never on camera and team calls, says that he's ill or he's got his children are home, they're homesick, whatever it is. He's very slow to respond during business hours. He's asked for a quick call. He's not available. He's not there. Email responses arrive late at night. Work product has been fine, but there's a concern being expressed here that there's just the worker is not handling the workload well, stressed, burnout, that kind of thing. Separately, payroll flags something unusual that this person has changed their direct deposit bank account on file twice since starting with the company. Both accounts are at small credit unions in different parts of the country, nowhere near where he claims to live. As we flag here on the bottom, neither concern alone really, and this looks like remote worker fraud, especially if you're not attuned to it. But when you start putting these together, a picture starts to emerge. And this creates something of a real challenge, right? Because these are different teams, different functions. How do we look at this in a kind of cross-contextual way? So that we can see and put these things together. So I want to go first to Julia to get your thoughts on how you approach that problem from, it's called a cross-disciplinary reporting pipeline.
Yeah, I love that phrase. And it is really important because no single team is going to be able to catch this alone. And it does require collaboration across silos and reaching across the aisle and making sure the information is coordinated and gathered together. So I always think it makes sense to have a defined escalation process, right? Rather than just waiting to deal with this on an ad hoc basis or thinking, well, the team will catch it when it comes up. So which types of triggers are going to go to one place, right? At what stage will IT make flags about, for example, IP address abnormalities? When will that require a conversation with the work owner or the hiring manager who's working with that contingent worker or remote worker? When does it require notifying HR? I think having in advance an idea of where these are going so that they're going to the same place and what triggers escalation to the next level. Maybe it's a point system. Maybe it's something else that says, well, if 3 of these 5 boxes are checked, then we have to investigate further. And making sure you are looping in your legal team once those boxes are checked or those flags are waved, either way, so that they can play point and direct the rest of that investigation to try to keep it attorney-client privilege, especially if you are talking about a state-sponsored actor who might be involved. That could cause some real heartburn for the company.
Noah, what are some technical strategies for identifying fraud?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would sort of think about them in 4 categories, right? There's time, systems, tools, and people. And for time, systems, and tools, I'm talking about accessing systems outside of normal work hours, like you had mentioned before, sort of this impossible traveler type situation where you have someone log on from California, but then also from China, right, in a very short period of time. Systems, so access to systems that folks usually shouldn't be accessing as part of their normal job function. Similarly, as a corollary to that, tools, right? Are people installing and executing tools that through normal course of business they should not be using? And the fourth one is people, right? Are they talking to and co-opting employees or pressuring them into performing actions on their behalf that they should not be otherwise? I think technical controls are a good first step for time, systems, and tools. For people, that's a little bit harder to detect and prevent from a technical perspective. But I don't know if I think a lot of people here might have like the report phishing button in Outlook. I was reading an article this morning that that increases the likelihood someone's going to report a phishing email by 30%. Now, granted, this was a study from a company that builds software for detecting phishing, so take it with a grain of salt. But intuitively, it makes it easier. And I'm not saying that everyone should have a button for reporting DPRK, state-sponsored individuals. But what I am suggesting is having sort of defined processes and escalation paths for these things and making that part of the culture and training can go a long way. If somebody sees something, they should say something.
Right, just the awareness alone. So Grace, I want to double click a little bit on the people part of NOAA's formulation and talk about that, because obviously there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do and a lot of deep technical investigation, but how do you manage that in an organization given like how much obviously insight that gives you into what people are doing at work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these tools are very helpful and they are becoming more and more advanced. But on the other hand, there is, I would say, a level of trust that you have to maintain with your employee population, right? And um, as this panel prepared for this call, we talked a little bit about whether there's an expectation of employee privacy when it comes to company assets. I would say my view, and I think the group generally came out here, is that regardless of what your company policy says, it probably says something like, the company is able to, view all company assets at all times, et cetera, et cetera. I would say typical privacy principles should still apply, especially that of proportionality. And that means that you're properly calibrating, monitoring to the role and to the risk. And so I think it's important for the legal team or the HR team to coordinate with IT so the monitoring is actually proportionate. I think whatever IT does in terms of reviewing things on the back end for the employee, that should be documented and defensible. That IT employee should not have full reign to do kind of whatever review they want. It should be within certain guardrails.
All right, so let's move to the next part of our story, which is the discovery. One morning, Omicron makes a shocking discovery. So some sweeping changes were made to Omicron's production cloud systems overnight, all by one of the contingent cloud network admins. The changes were broader than any one person should be able to do in one sitting. Kind of suggests AI, but again, as we said, that's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Why it's concerning, it's clearly concerning for some reason. The volume and pace of the workload they were generated by an AI tool, not a person. The admin appears to have pointed an AI agent at the company's production system and let it operate, but I'll do that oversight. That's definitely a problem. The contingent worker is not responding to questions from the engineering team about what happened, and that's obviously a big problem as well. And so no, from a technical standpoint, like what does it look like from day one where you see this and what are you looking at right away?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in cloud environments, there's typically like two sets of systems that you're going to look at, right? There's the control plane and the data plane. And just to, sort of high level briefly what those are. Control plane is the creation of resources, deletion of resources, configuration of your resources. Data plane is like the actual data going into your databases or your object storage or file systems, et cetera. And for a control plane, that would be something like an AWS and CloudTrail, GCP had, Google Cloud. They all have their versions of audit logs for these things, right? But you might see rapid behavior across a large number of resources from a single identity, right? Like Mike was saying, that might be an indication of AI usage. And you want to look at what resources are they creating, what resources are they deleting, right? If they're trying to cover up their tracks or denial of service, right? But also, what sensitive data are they taking out of your cloud environment, right? Or are they mutating things in a malicious way? So I would look, across control plane and data plane. Please, if you have one message to your technical teams, turn on audit logging in your cloud environments, turn on CloudTrail. It's on by default in GCP, but please turn on data access events where it makes sense. Same for Azure it helps us immensely when we actually get in there, or your teams to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good conversation to have, even if you're not technical, even if you don't know what any of that means, to say, if we had an event like this, what evidence would we be looking at? And if the answer is not clear, or we'd only go back a few days or whatever it is, you got a problem. So even if the technical aspects intimidate you, think about it as an evidence problem, which lawyers are very comfortable with. What would the evidence look like? How long would it go back? What would it show us? What would it not show us? And obviously, here's a very interesting example of how AI can exacerbate these things, how fast it can work, and how much trouble it can cause overnight in a way that a human being working at human speed, wouldn't necessarily be able to. Okay, so let's talk more about the investigation.
Yeah. So I'll jump in. I just want to point out that I think we're very lucky that in this particular instance that we actually saw a flag. I think in most cases, sophisticated actors, once they're already inside, you're not going to get a flag necessarily, or these flags that you have are going to be more subtle. So understanding that, I think just before framing this discussion, the most important thing you can take away today is to try to beef up your hiring and onboarding systems to avoid this problem in the first place. And this is sort of reactive to the circumstance. Any investigation is necessarily so. With that, I want to open up the floor to our panelists to discuss key considerations with respect to an investigation, and specifically, I think turning it over to Julia again about an incident response plan and how you'd go about managing this particular circumstance.
Well, I think the theme across all of my comments today is don't wait for a real live incident to arrive before you hone your incident response plan. Make sure all of the stakeholders know their roles, know what to do, know who to reach out to. If you are waiting, it's too late. So have the plan, have it in writing, but having a written plan alone is not going to be enough until you've run a tabletop exercise or even a full-scale exercise, a simulation to practice so people know what to do. Telling people, make sure you flag for X may not be enough until in the moment when an incident arises, they actually practice. They also have to know what outside vendors, outside counsel, forensics support to contact. And again, if you're waiting until the incident happens, then you're going to be thinking, who should I call? You want to know in advance. You want to have those engagement letters set. You want to know who you're going to contact. And your incident response plan should have a playbook for things like this. And it doesn't need to be deterministic, but you should at least have, for these types of incidents, considerations for your team to think about so that they're not flailing when something comes up. And again, with respect to these incidents in particular, having that process for very quickly disabling access and disabling any action that could come from that account or alias or whatever it is without tipping off the worker, right? A one-click kill switch that can impact all system access without having to loop in a broader team, right? And if you have other contingent workers who are the ones who are responsible for that kill switch, then you may find that out when you're doing a tabletop exercise and want to revisit. So thinking through all of it before you're in the hot seat that's like my one main takeaway that everybody should walk away from this presentation with.
Grace, any thoughts about privilege concerns in this context?
Absolutely. So I guess the first bullet we have here says, do we engage outside counsel to investigate? Obviously every company has to make that decision, but typically for, serious or high risk cases, you do want to consider hiring outside counsel. Kind of to Julia's point about, being prepared, getting engagement letters ready. If you are going to hire outside counsel, you do not want to be researching who that outside counsel is in this moment. You want to know who you're going to be calling in this moment, right? So doing that pre-work, to Julia's point, is important to know, that you've vetted that counsel before the investigation starts. Sort of a practical consideration there, and we don't have this on the slide, but is this external counsel covered under your insurance policies if this is a covered matter under your insurance? And again, that's part of the pre-work involved. In terms of privilege, having outside counsel involved definitely helps preserve privilege, especially if you are engaging an outside forensic investigator. You can have outside counsel engage that investigator. And that, really helps with privilege, because if internal counsel is engaging that outside investigator, there may be a question as to whether that internal counsel is acting in the capacity as a lawyer or as a business person. And so you don't want to leave that up to, discretion later on. And then I would say, just practically, these are typically things that, if you can keep sort of in short form, and not have all of the details in written communications, that's typically better. Pick up the phone is what I tell people across the company when it comes to things like this. If you can avoid the written paper trail, better for protection of the company later on.
What about evidence in this particular context, Noah? And thoughts about, from your perspective, when you're in the heat of the moment and you've got tipped off that there's a major issue here and you're now investigating it. What are your thoughts about evidence preservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. In particular, in the case where you have sent a physical device to somebody, or so you thought, and maybe it ended up at a laptop farm or something similar. Preservation of that physical device or the forensic artifacts from it, which you can do remotely in a lot of cases, is extremely important without tipping off the worker so they don't try and cover up their tracks. That's one thing. Or if you have provisioned like a virtual computer, like some people call them VDIs or Amazon workspaces or whatever you want to call them, right? In those cases, it's your computer, right? Or a computer that you control, but not in their physical possession. And to the point we were talking about earlier, I would encourage everybody, to the extent possible, even if you have contingent workers or contractors, try and get them working on an endpoint that you control and manage, because then you have visibility into what's going on in the endpoint, and you can, in these cases, preserve evidence much more effectively than if it's owned by the contracting company and not you. From cloud environments, and in particular third-party SaaS environments, in the latter case, retention can be as low as 4 to 7 days for artifacts. So try and make sure you're looking at, okay, what evidence is available in the Confluence Cloud, or whatever third-party SaaS you're using, Salesforce, et cetera. And then the artifacts from the onboarding and vetting can be very useful if they are readily available for your investigation later on. And make sure to have those handy as well.
Yeah. Well, let's go on the next slide, because I think the law enforcement notification question is an important one, but it's one of those that I really don't think that we can give you a sense of whether or not it's appropriate in a particular circumstance without having the specific details. I think our takeaway there would be, if you're thinking about making a referral, you should have outside counsel, because there are lots of considerations that you might want to take into account before making that referral, particularly if you haven't set up proper internal controls to deal with this circumstance on the front end. With respect to legal notification obligations, insurance, Julia, any thoughts there?
I was muted. Same comment, right? Plan ahead. With insurance, you may not have coverage for remote workers who are working outside the US or working from certain geographic areas. You should know that in advance. And if, like Grace said, if you have carrier requirements for what counsel you can engage, what vendors you can engage, you also need to know that in advance. So these are things that you should address upon renewal for your policies so that they are not surprises that you are then trying to negotiate either when an incident arises or even after you've bound a new policy. You also have to be careful about things like carrier notification. An incident happens, and if you want, if there's a chance it's going to be a covered matter, you need to notify them right away. And these things move really quickly. You may have requirements of your policy, and on cyber policies, this is really common where you need carrier buy-in and carrier approval before you're making a ransom payment, for example. So knowing who to contact, having your insurance broker's phone number on speed dial so you can send that bat signal to get that notification out really quickly are all things that you should probably do in advance, and understanding what the gaps might be so that if there's a chance you can close those gaps at renewal, you give it your best shot.
Yep. Well, let's move on because I think we're running low on time and we want to get into the sort of next stage of this investigation. Mike, do you want to set the stage on this?
So finally, we go back to our story here. Omicron goes through its investigation, has some very interesting findings. Noah, just briefly take us through kind of what stands out here in terms of what you typically see and how this looks like a standard case of North Korea remote worker fraud.
Yep, thanks. So, laptop shipped to a residential address in New Jersey, despite the worker's claim of working from his home in Arizona, right? So you have a clear mismatch between the physical location that the worker says they're in and where the laptop is residing, right? So that could be laptop farm, some other kind of facilitator. Person living at Arizona address appears to have no relevant technical background, right? So this could be another piece of evidence from a stolen identity where clearly that person is not sitting at a home in Arizona. They're maybe somewhere in Asia or otherwise. And so the identity doesn't sort of match up with what the person claimed. Several social media accounts in the worker's name were all created in the last few months. So this goes to Grace's point of account freshness, right? Is this like a brand new account that someone created just for the purpose of getting a job? Or does it have some sort of history behind it that makes it look like it's a real human? In this case, absolutely not. They're generic posts. Maybe they were copied images or slightly edited from, someone else's profile. Phone number, Google Voice could be totally legitimate, but this is another signal, right? And email address is no data breach history. That's kind of an interesting signal where maybe someone has really good security hygiene, but I myself pride myself on being pretty good, and I even have email addresses that are in a breach database. Laptop artifacts, right? So we talked about if somebody is physically located outside of the United States, but their laptop is in New Jersey, then they're going to need to connect remotely, right? And that could be through remote management tools like AnyDesk and Chrome Remote Desktop, like we talked about here. It could be through key video and mouse devices, which KVM for short. If you hear that term, that's what that means. But essentially allows someone to control a computer remotely. We also found extensive artifacts showing AI agent use across the worker's daily activity, which sort of correlates to the cloud activity that Mike and I were talking about earlier. And then finally, sign-ins regularly originate from IP addresses associated with the VPN service, right? And when we say VPN service, more generically, it might be called anonymizing proxy. It allows someone to hide their physical location when connecting to something over the internet. We see threat actors use this a lot. There are legitimate use cases, but there are also some VPN services that have very low bars for, sort of know your customer or identity verification. And so threat actors tend to like to use those.
Okay, so let's jump ahead here a bit to the potential consequences of an imposter hire. Obviously, a very scary thing. Talk about what that looks like. I will kick that off by making an obvious but important point, the cyber and data one. You've got someone who wasn't supposed to be in your network was in there for weeks or months or however. Sometimes these take a very long time to discover. Is that a personal data breach? Is there access to confidential information that now you've got contractual obligations that speak to that are a problem? reportable security incidents under SEC regulations or other regulations. There's a lot going on there. It is a very complex security incident, and it's be very hard to, given that they were approved to be inside, you just didn't know who they actually were. That's going to be very difficult in a way that more so in some ways than if it was someone who was an outsider the entire time. Second, I will highlight briefly sanctions. If you paid someone in North Korea, that's bad. North Korea is a comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction, or someone who is subject to sanctions. If you do that knowingly, that you can go to jail, so don't do that. There is strict liability and civilly if you pay, even if you didn't know. However, the good news is there's not been any civil enforcement of companies. My own gloss on this is if you are trying to put controls in place, trying to detect people, working with law enforcement, trying to do the right thing. I don't think the risk there is particularly high, but it is there and something you need to be aware of. So let's keep going through our list of horribles here. Julia, securities.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Mike just said, I think the reputational risk, even absent sanctions, is pretty bad. You don't need the sanctions to have this become a real problem for your company. If you are a company that handles MNPI, whether that's a public company with undisclosed earnings data, an asset manager with trading activity or portfolio positions, you may also end up with a securities law problem on your hands. That can trigger disclosure requirements. There are strict timelines. And it's just another reason why that cross-functional approach we talked about earlier is really important, because this can turn into a many-tentacled beast with a lot of different requirements.
Hey, Grace, what about financial?
Yeah, I mean, there could be really serious financial impacts to the business as a result of this activity. Not only salaries paid to the fraudulent workers, any extortion demands, any investigation and remediation costs, the cost of lawyers, on the legal and regulatory front, conversations with regulators, any penalties that could be imposed, class action lawsuits, and customer and vendor disputes, all of that adds up.
Yeah, for sure. We have seen the extortion demands to tell you that someone gets caught and it turns into a ransomware attack.
Exactly.
And then Jeremy, finally, how about reputational?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a problem for any company, particularly those that are secret keepers or that are entrusted with confidential information. Customers obviously do not want to be in a situation where they're buying a product from a company that doesn't know who their own workers are. I think there's a brand damage potential. There's the national security implications when foreign actors are involved. But more to the point, I think there's a certain sense of you don't know what you're doing if you hire people that you don't know who they are. And that just can hurt, I think, overall the company. One thing we haven't talked about much here is the impact on the culture and the workplace. And it's not just that you hire people to do a function and then they insert that output into the workplace for you. It's a real human place where people work and interact. And when that gets destroyed because of a circumstance like this, it's hard to rebuild that sense of trust among the workplace, among the community of people who actually work somewhere. So it is really important to get ahead of this and to try and avoid this risk. And it is a very real risk. People probably listening today thinking, well, how likely is this really to happen to me, my company? And the short answer is you may already have that issue today without really knowing it. So it is a big deal. Maybe we should move on because we only have about 4 minutes left, just to quickly talk about moonlighting, because I think that this is a similar issue with a different flavor. It's not necessarily a nefarious actor, but it's one whose goal is to make as much money as they can, and it's much easier in this day and age to be able to perform two jobs at once without your employer knowing it. So. Julia, briefly on this, policies you might want to have in place on this?
Have a written moonlighting policy. Again, plan ahead. Don't wait for a problem to happen. Make sure that you don't just have a policy, but you've trained people on it, right? The worst thing that you can do besides not having a policy is have one that you do not enforce. So make sure it's covering what counts as a conflict of interest. You may be okay with someone working as a barista after hours, but what are the things that would be a problem, right? Competitors, vendors, anything where someone might have a financial interest, but map that out so you're not just waiting for a problem to come up. Again, that's my theme.
Grace, some thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, if someone's working for another employer and they have access to sensitive or proprietary information, you just want to make sure you have the proper protections in place so that all of that very important company information is not shared with another employer, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Make sure that there are proper protections in place for AI tool misuse, whether that's to mask reduced effort or to deliver another company's work. And then just thinking through practical detection challenges. I think that in a remote culture, especially with engineers who are sitting in front of their computers all day, how do you actually detect this kind of activity without overreach?
Yeah, to that point, I mean, any thoughts from the panelists about how to create a culture of compliance or about how to get more information from your own workforce about whether there's a suspected member of the team who's not real or who might be moonlighting?
I think as others have said, I mean, awareness is the first thing. I mean, you step back, you're someone who doesn't deal with this. Like, this is such a crazy thing. Can you imagine you're working and you're like, oh yeah, that IT guy is like a North Korean hacker. I mean, this is insane, right? But it's not. It's real. And so you can't really blame people for like, I didn't think that that remote worker was a North Korean hacker. I didn't raise the flag. That doesn't sound plausible to most people. But if you tell them like this is an actual thing and this is crazy, but it really does happen, these are things that you need to flag. And going back to like when you mentioned like the smell test or whatever, right? That you need to understand that if you're like this guy, this is just odd, and then it's just never around, or like their speech is always delayed, or it's just something's not right. Like it's okay to raise that and say, it's just, I don't know, I can't articulate what kind of problem this is, but it's some kind of problem. That goes really, really long way. But people have to know that there's a reason we're asking you to flag this, because this is actually, as wild as it sounds, a real thing that can happen.
Any other parting thoughts from our panel? It looks like we only got one question here, which is about recommending a vendor. So we'll have to take that one offline and maybe respond to the person who made that request afterwards. But any other thoughts from our panel? All right. Well, it's 1:30 now. We're out of time. I really want to thank everyone for attending this session. We've just, I think, scratched the surface of this issue. There's lots more we could talk about. And I'm sure that all of our panelists would be happy to answer those questions if folks want to reach out to us. Our information is in our materials that we supplied today. We really want to thank the panelists, my fellow panelists, for joining me today. Thank you for coming.
Jeremy, if I could jump in and thank you and everybody else who participated in the program today. At this point, we do have to conclude the formal part of the session. On behalf of the chapter, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Davis Wright Tremaine, and all of the panelists, Jeremy, Michael, Grace, Julia, and Noah. To obtain your Virginia CLE form for the conference, please look for an email from Beth McConnell within the next few days. And that email will include a link to the CLE form and a survey seeking feedback about today's conference. We hope you'll complete the survey to provide input about the conference and your interest for future programming. Thanks to all of the members for participating in today's conference and the program.